Hello everyone, this is Laura Slade, and I want to welcome you to today's lesson on energy flow in the biosphere. So we all know that organisms need energy in order to survive and reproduce. The question is, where does this energy come from? And most people can tell you that this energy ultimately comes from the sun. Today, we're going to find out how true that is, and we're also going to find out what processes cause the flow of energy through the biosphere, such as photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, and cellular respiration. And then we're going to look at some different ways that we can represent this flow of energy, such as using a food chain, food web, or a food pyramid. So if the energy for all of life's processes on Earth comes from the sun, then how is it harnessed? Well, that is done through a process called photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that happens inside living cells, particularly in plants. And what happens during the process of photosynthesis is that carbon dioxide and water are converted into glucose and oxygen using light energy from the sun. So carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, glucose and oxygen are the products. And it turns out that glucose is an excellent form of chemical potential energy. This means that the bonds inside a glucose molecule have a lot of energy stored in them. And we can use that energy when we break a glucose molecule apart. That's how we use this chemical potential energy that is created by capturing the energy from the sun. So we're actually going to talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration in detail in one of our later topics. For right now, we just want to recognize the main goal of photosynthesis and be able to describe its reactants and its products. Interestingly, of all of the light that reaches the Earth's surface, only a tiny fraction of it is actually absorbed by plants through the process of photosynthesis. However, this small amount of energy that's added to the biosphere is enough to produce 150 to 200 billion tons of organic matter each year. As it turns out, photosynthesis is not the only way that energy can be introduced into the biosphere. There is another similar process called chemosynthesis that is also able to harness energy. Now, chemosynthesis was first discovered in about 1977 in some deep ocean vents at the bottom of the sea floor. It was discovered that there were some bacteria that actually could use hydrogen sulfide, water, and carbon dioxide and oxygen, and they could also produce sugar without the energy from the sunlight. So this is a different form of basically creating that chemical potential energy found in sugar or glucose. Now, the waste product of chemosynthesis is actually sulfuric acid. So it's a very different ecosystem where chemosynthesis is involved. And we usually consider it to be less of an important process than photosynthesis. Although, since 1977, we have discovered lots of other bacteria and other microorganisms that also use chemosynthesis. So it turns out it's not as rare as we once thought. So here is one of these deep ocean vents where chemosynthetic bacteria were discovered. And actually, they are bacteria that live inside these tube worms that produce this sugar, and the rest of the ecosystem is based off of the energy that's harnessed by those bacteria. So once this energy is harnessed from the sunlight, how is it actually used in organisms during their lifetime? Well, the way that we use this energy is through a chemical process called cellular respiration. This also happens inside living cells. And in this chemical reaction, glucose reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water. And in the process, a different type of energy is made, a type of energy called ATP. ATP is actually a molecule that also contains high energy bonds, and that energy can be used when the bonds are broken. But unlike glucose, ATP is a form of energy that's very easy for our cells to actually use. So we can consider ATP to be useful energy. So once again, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration in a later topic. For right now, we just want to be able to recognize the reactants and the products and talk about how this chemical reaction is important, or this metabolic reaction, because it happens inside of our cells. The other thing you might notice about cellular respiration is that its chemical equation is actually the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So they're exactly opposite equations, whereas cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide and water, photosynthesis uses water and carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration uses glucose and oxygen, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and water. So we know that photosynthesis fixes the sun's energy. Cellular respiration converts it into a type of energy that can be used to do work. Well, let's talk about where these processes happen. So first of all, photosynthesis occurs in only a few organisms. Plants for sure, a couple bacteria, and other little microorganisms. We call those organisms producers because they can produce their own energy. Another word for producers is actually autotrophs. So autotroph literally translates to self-feeding. These are organisms that feed themselves, they make their own food. On the other hand, organisms that cannot do photosynthesis are called consumers because they have to eat another organism in order to get their energy. And consumers are also called heterotrophs. So heterotroph literally translates to other feeding. Heterotrophs have to feed on other organisms to get their energy. Now, we know that plants do photosynthesis. We often think that it's animals then that would do cellular respiration, but actually cellular respiration is done by all organisms in order to actually use this energy, and that includes plants. So after plants have stored the sun's energy as glucose, they then use that glucose in the process of cellular respiration to turn it into usable energy. So let's look at one of the ways that we can represent or chart energy flow through the biosphere, and that's through this tool called a food chain. So a food chain is going to show us basically the order of organisms that energy is transferred through as it moves through the biosphere. And in this particular food chain, we see that energy starts by coming in through the sun. So we know that sun is going to provide almost all of the energy to the biosphere, disregarding chemosynthesis. And of course, we need a producer, which is usually a plant, to actually harness this energy. In this case, it's going to be grass. So the grass is our autotroph. Everything else in this food chain is going to be considered a heterotroph because it has to get its energy from somewhere else. So in this case, the grasshopper gets its energy from the grass. The shrew, which is kind of like a mouse, gets its energy from the grasshopper. And the owl gets its energy from the shrew. Now there's a couple different ways that we can talk about all of the different organisms in this food chain. So we can talk about the grass as a producer. We said it produces its own energy. That means everything else in this food chain is a consumer. But in order for us to be able to differentiate between the role of the grasshopper, the shrew, and the owl in this food chain, we can give them slightly different names. So we're going to call the grasshopper a primary consumer. And primary means first. It is the first consumer in this food chain. The shrew then is going to be a secondary consumer. So secondary means it's the second consumer. And tertiary consumer is the name that we give the owl. So tertiary means that it is the third consumer in this food chain. Now there's one more way that we can name each of the organisms in this food chain, and that's by disregarding whether or not it makes its own food and just talking about the order that it comes in the food chain. And when we talk about them that way, we call them tropic levels. So the grass is the first tropic level in this food chain. The grasshopper is the second tropic level. The shrew is the third tropic level, and the owl is the fourth tropic level. So these are three different ways that we can name the different organisms in a food chain. Now there's one more important note to make about this food chain, and that's the fact that the sun in this food chain is a constant input of energy. So the sun never, in our lifetime at least, is going to run out. It's going to continue to provide energy to this food chain. And because there is this constant input of energy from an outside source in the biosphere, we consider the biosphere to be an open system in terms of energy. So that means that material, in this case energy, is constantly being added. Now there's one more important role that we can add to this food chain, and that is shown in this food chain by an earthworm. His role is that he is a decomposer. So decomposers need to get their energy from another source, just like consumers. However, we typically don't call them consumers because decomposers eat dead material. So unlike the shrew who hunts down live grasshoppers, the earthworm is only going to eat the shrew after it's died and is being decomposed. So the earthworm can really enter this food chain at any of a number of different levels. So he could be considered a second, third, fourth, or even a fifth tropic level in this food chain, depending on exactly what it is that he's decomposing. Now it's important to note that whether we talk about the earthworm or if we leave him out and look at the end of this chain being the owl, what we need to know is that energy stops at the end of the food chain. So the energy transfer is either going to stop with the owl or it's going to stop with the earthworm, which means that energy never travels backwards through this food chain. The grass is never going to get energy from the grasshopper. The grasshopper is never going to get its energy from the shrew. So we can see then that there is a one-way flow of matter through the biosphere, starting with the sun and ending with our highest tropic level or our highest level consumer. This is another way that we can describe that the biosphere is an open system in terms of energy because we need that constant input of energy from the sun for this food chain to continue. Now, food chains are an excellent way to observe the one-way flow of energy through the biosphere. However, they're really not complicated enough to show us the big picture of what's going on in an ecosystem, and that is where a food web comes in. So a food web is a bunch of food chains stitched together that show us the big picture of what's happening in an ecosystem. In a food web, we're still going to be able to observe our autotrophs, or our producers. In this case, it is the berries and the plantain. Everything else in this food web is going to be a consumer, or a heterotroph. And then the food web is going to show us all of the different possible ways that energy can be transferred through the biosphere. So for example, the plantain is going to harness energy from the sun. That energy can be transferred to the mouse and then transferred again to the fox. Now, there's one other benefit of observing these relationships in a food web as opposed to the more simplistic food chain. So for example, let's take a look at the buzzard. If we want to describe what the buzzard is, well, we know that he's a heterotroph, that he's a consumer, but what level consumer is he? So let's start by labeling our food chain with the plantain as a first tropic level. That would make the rabbit a second tropic level, and it would make the buzzard the third tropic level in this particular food web. However, what the food web is going to show us is that this buzzard can also occupy a different tropic level if he changes his diet. For example, let's start with the berries as our first tropic level. That would make this bird at the second tropic level, the snake at the third tropic level, and finally the buzzard at the fourth tropic level. So the food web is going to show us that each organism can occupy a different level in the food chain depending on exactly what his diet choices are. Now there's one more way that we can use a food web to describe what's happening in an ecosystem, and that is if we want to start to predict what could happen if there was a change in this ecosystem. For example, let's take a look at this bird. Let's say that this population or these birds are devastated by disease. All the birds die. What is going to be the result of that? Well, first of all, we can look at the organisms above the bird in the food chain. For example, the snake. For this snake, the bird is his only source of food. So this snake is really going to be in bad shape if all of the birds die. Probably all the snakes will disappear as well. The buzzard and the fox are also organisms that rely on this bird as a source of food. However, the buzzard and the fox both have alternative food that they can eat as well, such as the mouse. So the buzzard and the fox might be negatively affected if all the birds disappear, but chances are they'll still survive. Now let's take a look at what happens in the lower levels of the food chain underneath the bird. For example, the ladybug and the berries. Well, if there is no bird to eat you, then the ladybug population is going to increase because their predators have disappeared. They don't get eaten, they're going to survive more often. Same with the berries. Although we can see that the bird is not the only predator or the only consumer for these berries, the berries will still get eaten by things like the grasshopper, the butterfly, and the greenfly. So let's take one more look at our food chain. And this time, we're going to talk about the flow of energy quantitatively. That means with numbers. Now, in order to know what's going to happen quantitatively to the energy in this food chain, we have to know about the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics describe how energy behaves in the biosphere. And for our purposes, there are two laws of thermodynamics that we need to know. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form into another. So that tells us that the grass is not pulling energy out of thin air. It has to come from somewhere. We know it's coming from the sun. It also means that the energy that the owl possesses, when the owl dies, it doesn't just disappear. It has to go somewhere. Where does it go? Well, the second law of thermodynamics gives us a bit of a hint. The second law of thermodynamics states that energy is lost as heat. So, when the grasshopper metabolizes the grass that he's eaten, so when he digests it, this energy transfer is not going to be 100% efficient. In fact, most of the energy that was present in the grass is going to be lost as heat to the environment. So it's not destroyed, it's still there. It's just converted into a form that this food web, or this food chain, cannot use. And this is going to be true of each energy conversion. So when the shrew digests the grasshopper, some of the energy is lost as heat, and the same with the owl. How much energy is lost as heat as opposed to how much is actually used by the next tropic level? Well, results vary depending on exactly which food chain and which organisms we're talking about, but in general, we can use the rule of 10. The rule of 10 states that approximately 10% of the energy transferred to the next tropic level is actually used. The other 90% of the energy is lost as heat. So let's look at 100% of the energy that's present in all of the grass in this ecosystem. Only 10% of that energy will be used by the grasshoppers. Then, the shrews get only 10% of the energy that the grasshoppers have. 10% of 10, that leaves us with 1%. And again, the owl gets only 10% of the energy that's present in the shrew. That's going to work out to only 0.1% of the energy that was originally present in the grass in this ecosystem. So it turns out that the energy flow through the biosphere is actually really inefficient. And because there's so little energy available to higher trophic levels, it actually means that this ecosystem cannot support very many individuals of those higher trophic levels because there's just not enough energy to go around. So, the law of thermodynamics, in particular the second law of thermodynamics, in conjunction with this rule of 10, leaves us with something called an energy pyramid. And the energy pyramid shows the relative number of individuals at each trophic level based on the amount of energy that they have available to them. Now we can talk about measure of energy in terms of kilocalories. This is one of the units of measurement that we can use. So let's say there are 1,000 kilocalories of energy present in the grass. The next tropic level, the grasshoppers, they will have 100 kilocalories available to them. The shrews, 10 kilocalories. And then finally, our tertiary consumer, the owl, will have only 1 kilocalorie per 1,000 kilocalories of grass in this ecosystem. And this gives us this pyramid shape if we were to chart out the number of individuals. So let's review what we've learned about energy so far in this lesson. First of all, we know that, in general, all the energy in the Earth comes from the sun, although actually this is an oversimplification, and really we have to remember that chemosynthesis also introduces energy into the biosphere. Then we know that energy is fixed by photosynthesis. This means that the energy from the sun is harnessed into a form that the rest of the biosphere can use. And when the biosphere uses energy, it uses it in the process of cellular respiration. Next, we showed how food chains were a way to represent the flow of energy through the biosphere. And we observed how the second law of thermodynamics creates a pyramid of energy in the biosphere, where each tropic level has only 10% of the energy present in the previous tropic level. And one other concept that we discussed was the fact that the biosphere is an open system in terms of energy. That means that there's a one-way flow of energy through the biosphere, and this is only possible because the sun provides a constant input of energy. So that is how energy is transferred through the biosphere.